So welcome everybody. Lovely to see you all. Welcome back to those who've been before to our Fundamentals Beauty series, and welcome if you're new tonight. My name's Mel Dodd, and I am the Programme Director of Spatial Practice. We are the programme that hosts the series, and very happy to have you. We've also got our staff and students here, alumni and so on. So it's a series that we've run for 3 years, and we've gradually expanded our volume of audience. So it's this series has been particularly spectacular for being sold out. So it's great to have such a lot of interest. I'm really going to hand over to my chair, Ollie Wainwright. As you all probably know, Ollie is architecture critic for The Guardian and has co-hosted this series with us for the last 3 years. But also, I just want to say, perhaps we need to give Ollie a special round of applause this year, because this week, because it's the last Fundamentals. We did a series of 3, and we thought 3 is a good number to stop. It's been brilliant, but we'll move on to the next thing. So, welcome to Ollie, and also thank you so much. Amazing.
Wow. Thank you very much, Mel, and thank you all for coming. It's a very emotional moment for me, given that it's the 12th debate that we've done here over the last 3 years. We've amassed over 20 hours of YouTube footage of fiery debates, so if any of you ever have insomnia, you know where to look. So this is the third and final one of this particular series, looking at beauty, pegged to the government's new Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, established to make housing developments more palatable to the general public. Over the last 4 weeks, we've looked at public attitudes to beauty, how architects and house builders perceive beauty, and this week we're looking at the planning system and planners' attitude to beauty, asking ultimately, is it possible to regulate beauty? Now, to me, it's the most kind of fundamental of the 3 debates so far, given that planners are ultimately the kind of gatekeepers of beauty. They're the ones who decide whether a project is worthy of being built or if the architects are going to get sent back to the drawing board. And in that position, they play an incredibly important role as the kind of sole interface between the ambitions of the developers and the kind of forces of global capital on the one hand, and the needs and desires of existing communities on the other. So where does the planning system stand on this kind of nebulous idea of beauty? If you look at the current national planning policy framework, which I'm sure you all do on a regular basis, you'll see that it mentions beauty a whole 9 times. But it's interesting that in those references, it only ever relates to nature. They talk about areas of outstanding natural beauty, the beauty of the countryside, the scenic beauty in national parks, and the beauty of local green space. The only other mention of kind of the aesthetics of the built environment comes in very nebulous phrases like, new developments should be visually attractive. They should be sympathetic to local character and history and maintain a strong sense of place. So, what parameters are we actually using to define these fairly vague and nebulous ambitions? To me, there often seems to be an obsession in local planning departments for new developments to be in keeping. But are we privileging continuity at the expense of good design, innovation, and ultimately beauty? We're drowning in endless design guides, conservation area guidance, and protected viewing corridors, but do these rules actually lead to better buildings, communities, and spaces? London's skyline is just one example of the kind of arbitrary nature of these rules, where the dome of St. Paul's is kind of preserved at all costs. But what about the Gherkin, the beloved Gherkin, which has been crowded out by endless new towers? So who decides what views should be preserved and why? So ultimately, does the current planning apparatus actually serve its purpose? Or do we need to rethink the way that beauty is assessed and regulated? Is it more about preserving the profits of house builders than maximizing public benefit and providing the best new homes? So, with me to answer some of these questions and hopefully many more, we have a brilliant range of speakers from across the spectrum of architecture and planning. We're going to begin with Nicolas Boyce-Smith, who is the founding director of Create Streets, an independent research institute that campaigns for the creation of terraced streets of houses and apartments rather than high-rise buildings. Nicolas is actually one of the 4 recently appointed commissioners to the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, so we're very pleased to have him. Next, we're going to be hearing from Alpa Depani, who is an architect and also part of the first cohort of public practice, which I'm sure many of you know is the new organization set up to encourage the best designers to go into the public sector. Alpa is currently working at the London Borough of Sutton on town centre redevelopment, the public realm SPG, and housing design codes. After Alpa, we're going to hear from architect Amin Taha, who is the founder of Group Work and Amin Taha Architects, whose work has been nominated for the Sterling Prize, and whose brilliant Clerkenwell Close project, whose rugged, load-bearing stone facade has been the subject of a long-running dispute with the local planners. So we'll see what his attitudes are to the planning system. After Amin, we're going to hear from Deirdra Armsby. Special thanks to Deirdra for stepping in at very short notice. Deirdra is the Director of Place Shaping and Town Planning at the City of Westminster, which is the biggest planning authority in the UK, handling over 12,000 applications annually. Before joining Westminster, she was Director of Planning at Newham, overseeing Olympic developments, and she's also worked at Hackney and Kensington and Chelsea councils. And finally, we'll be hearing from Grayson Perry, Turner Prize-winning potter, textile artist, sculptor and printmaker, and co-designer of the celebrated House for Essex with Charles Holland, which was initially described by the local planning authority as a blot on the landscape, but I would argue is one of the most original houses built in this country. Grayson is Chancellor of the University of the Arts and a long-time collaborator with fashion students here at Central St Martin's. So each one of them is going to give a punchy 5-minute presentation, much more punchy than my introduction has been. We're then going to have a debate up here, and then I'll crucially open it up to questions and heckles from you guys. So please be thinking of points that you want to put to our speakers. So without further ado, please welcome Nicolas Boyce-Smith.
That's the right one. Thank you very much indeed. Hang on, I think there's a... Brilliant. Can we regulate beauty? I'm going to say, oh, I've gone forward already. There we go. I'm going to say 4 things. So if you get bored after the next 30 seconds, you can stop, basically, because this is all I'm going to say. So first of all, I'm going to say it is right that beauty is not the only thing that matters in the built environment, as many people say, but that doesn't mean that beauty doesn't matter. I'm going to say that quite quickly. Secondly, that beauty may be in the eye of the beholder, but the components of beauty are in the beholder's brain. So the elements that go to define it. Thirdly, I'm going to say, and the good news is that the revolution in data on urban form allows us to see positive consequences from good urban design and beauty in terms of value, sustainability, popular support, and well-being. And finally, and hopefully at greater length, I'm going to say you may not be able to regulate beauty per se, but I think you can plan with far more certainty and with better understanding of data on good outcomes. And that would lead to a dramatically broader range of people who are able to develop and build and design homes and places than the weirdly concentrated market we have. If I want you to take one key thing away from what I say this evening, it's that we have an astonishingly weird planning system, historically and comparatively, that is fundamentally failing the vast majority of the population. I think we should change that. So remember that, nothing else. Could you all please put up your hands? I'm going to go down. This is the question. What proportion of health might be derived from your environment? 100%. Take it down when I take the number you think is correct. 100%, 90%, 80%, 70%, 40%, 20%. Most of you put it down at about 40 or 50. You're right. About 40% of our health is a function of our built environment. The rest is a function of who we are, our genetics, how much we smoke, walk, etc., independent of where we live. This is what makes a great place in all the data. Connectivity, density, greenery, homes, facade patterns, urban blocks, landscapes, height, space, design. Light cuts across all of those. All of those things matter. People are leaving or they're arriving, not quite clear. These are some of the things that then, if you like, are the links between urban form and our mental and physical well-being. Environmental stressors, social environmental stressors, level of social support, environmental symbol, and the planning process. To what degree planning is done at us, to what degree we're able to collaborate in it. This is incredibly important stuff. I think probably quite a high proportion of you are designers or architects or students in these things. You are doing an incredibly important job, and what you aspire to do is incredibly important, and I think what designers and planners have sought to do in this country for 20, 30, 40 years has been undervalued. Just a little bit of the data, then I'll come into beauty. Street trees really matter. You can measure the impact of street trees on public health and well-being. Mixed-use areas is one of the most astonishingly good drivers of people's propensity to walk, propensity not to use the car. We've just done a bit of research coming out next month where we found mixed use was the single greatest predictive factor in 19,000 streets and squares we looked at in people's propensity to desire to be there. Incredibly important. Commuting is very bad for you. I don't have the time to go through the data, so you're just going to have to trust me. Living in very big blocks is very bad for you. We've looked at every single peer-reviewed study over the last 40 years. I think just under 90%, no, so just under 80%, excuse me, essentially finds a predictable correlation between living in a very big anonymized building and less good mental well-being or social interaction with your neighbours. That's not to say it's always bad all the time for everyone. It's absolutely not. They tend to work incredibly well for rich people without children living in city centres. That's the platonic ideal of living in a tower block. Doesn't mean that it's not right for everyone all the time. Social interactions on streets, incredibly important. The number of neighbours that you know, that you're friendly with, is incredibly important to your mental health. This is the first brilliant study that was done on this in 1977 by Brian Appleyard. There was another good one in Bristol a few years ago. What it basically shows, the less traffic there is, the more people you know. So I hope I'm not speaking too fast. The more people you know and the better that is for you. Conventional blocks, this is an urban design pattern we've done, incredibly important. If you've got a conventionally conceived block with very clear fronts and very clear backs, that is correlated in very good data from Australia, slightly good data from the UK, with lower crime. Crime tends to be bad with you, for you, fear of crime even more so. Why have I got this slide up? Yes. It's actually from something I was doing today. This is from one of our fellows. We can measure now scenicness. How people respond to images. So these are ratings out of 10. People respond very well to very high scenic images, less well to unscenic. But this is predictable. We can predict with high confidence what images and places people find scenic, and then we've got a book on this coming out next month. We can then link that to elements of the street pattern. We're able to, I don't think I've got the slides here, no, I haven't got the time, but we've done a street score of every street in Greenwich. We can use the level of scenicness linked with other factors to predict house prices and to predict index of multiple deprivation. And the academic who did this, Dr. Chinuki Soniche, can also correlate the degree of scenicness with mental health. It's a better correlation than the amount of greenery. This is similar data from the US, which is too boring to read out. Now, the reason that we know this is right is because developers, Ollie talked about the forces of global capital. Developers use the language of this type of stuff, of beautiful, conventional, walkable places. They just don't mean the reality. So calling somewhere a garden does not make it a garden. Calling somewhere a square does not make it a square. And I'm a bit older than some of you. I checked that with my 6-year-old. I think he was 6 when I did this. And he's quite clear, that is not a square. So my issue is not that it's called Malaysia, but there's a reason they call it a square. And with all apologies to Mr. Tony Pidgley, calling somewhere a village does not make it a village. Calling somewhere human scale does not make it human scale. I don't know if you've met any human scales that I haven't, and I don't wish to. This is my new personal favourite. Calling a tower the Canaletto does not make it the fucking Canal Grande. It's ridiculous. But the good news is the vast majority of the population see through this bullshit and don't believe it. In a survey that Reba did 10 years ago that didn't like the outcome to, 2/3 of people said they didn't want to buy a newly built house. And in more recent surveys, you get very similar numbers. There's a very recent one from last year. So the public sniff this out. Right, my second point. Beauty may be, individual beauty, what you or you or you or you or you find beauty, I can't predict. But I can predict what about 80% of most audiences will find beautiful. And that's because the same elements, I haven't really got time to go through this, but composure in a facade pattern. There's something to look at the closer you get to it and the further you walk away, and that is vaguely symmetrical. I'm afraid I haven't got our new slides from our next book on some of the neuroscience on this, but places that are, facade patterns that are broadly symmetrical, not identically, perfectly symmetrical, which have got something to look at as you get closer and further away and have some sense of place. That's not to say, it's absolutely not to say that there isn't a place for buildings that shock or startle or amaze. There absolutely is, particularly in big cities. But most of us, particularly in the streets that we live and spend time in, we want something that's just a little bit more soothing most of the time. That's not to say things need to look exactly like they were built in 1820, but it is to say that there are elements of a symmetrical, slightly composed facade pattern that most people find attractive. We can see that in the polling. We've done lots on this. We've done over 100 polls with workshops, and we've also done ones with Mori. When we published this in the Architects Journal, I got 7 barrels of shit coming at me through social media, which is always fun. But bless them, the people who sent the 7 barrels, they missed the point. They were so this is basically what would you most like to see built. So you just from memory, 64% basically went up to 75% for Poundbury, or down to 23% for some award-winning architecture, a 50 percentage point swing, which is way more than Murray was expecting. And people were so cross that Poundbury came top. They completely missed that Duensthorpe, a marvellous, if you like, polite, vernacular, modern development in Yorkshire, came within essentially equidistant statistically. You get a 1.5% margin of error in a survey of 1,000 people done in the UK population. So it doesn't have to look antique, but it does have to have the components that people find attractive. And that's incredibly predictable. This is some polling we've not yet published. Incredibly predictable what people find more attractive. It's the left or on the right, because there's more to look at. There's just more to engage with mentally. Again, some polling we've not done. This is very carefully controlled polling. We had a CGI expert working on this just to look at the impact. So we've controlled for trees, number of people, amount of greenery. It's not quite the same, but actually it's more. And you get a much higher proportion of people finding the slightly more elevated facade with more of a sense of the place attractive. And that, in all the polling we've seen, is true across every proportion of the population, except, I'm afraid to say, architects and designers. This is a one we did, which mirrors some work by David Halpern, the head of the Cabinet Office Behavioural Insight Unit, where we found 87% of people preferred to see the two buildings on the top built, 13% preferred the bottom two. I'm afraid of that 13%, just under half are architects or designers. There's a measurable design disconnect. And by the way, he wants me to keep going, but I'm
That's the stop signal.
No, it's just going to be just another 10 seconds. The good news is there is a virtuous circle here. So what I'm not saying is developers need to lose money, because that's not a good way often to make things happen. This is a survey or study we did of every single property sale in London in 2016. We worked with two urban morphologists and data scientists to link back the data on value to metrics of urban form. And this is what we found. This is connecting for everything else. We were able to do that because we had enough data. Areas with an above-average number of pre-1900 properties, proximate to a listed building, or with a high intersection density, which is a measure of a conventional street pattern, has a place value premium 6 or 7 times greater than the new build premium. Interestingly, none of Savills or the nice people there want to particularly publish that. We also found that the best predictor in every single city of areas of high index of multiple deprivation were areas of high density and high degrees of open space. This is important stuff. Here's a fascinating study. It's the only study comparable to ours in terms of its data richness, done in Holland, the VIMEX programme of urban extensions that you probably know about, a fantastic range of data, 60,000 transactions. I'm about to get provocative, I apologise in advance. They were categorised by architects into 3 sets. Traditional, referring to traditional, and modern. Adjusting for everything else, size of property, connectivity, etc. The ones that are traditional sold, I think, at a 15% premium, holding everything else similar. So there is I'm being provocative putting that up there. We also find that very high-rise buildings, this is some fantastic new research done by Philip Steadman at UCL, very high, very big buildings are less energy efficient. There's a huge energy efficiency associated with being in a high-dense urban core, but once you get into very big buildings, you need to rely, as I'm sure we do here, on high degrees of heating or air conditioning in all circumstances. Now, planning, and then I'll stop in the next 10 seconds, I promise. There are 2 ways in which planning completely fucks it up for us right now. That's a technical architectural term. Sorry, Deborah, I know Deirdre. The first is that it bans the type of urban form that is provably most valuable and which most people most like. This is what you can build with the light rules in Victoria. You take out half the height. The type of finely grained, dense urbanism, that is worth more, in which people are happier, is all but banned by some of the building and planning regs. Actually, it's getting easy to get around some of this. Here's an Edwardian mansion block. It is almost impossible to build with that degree of density at the moment, because these things breaks half the light rules for the rooms at the back. The rooms at the front are very light and spacious. The rooms at the back, the smaller bedroom, the kitchen, whatever it might be, will break the light regs. They're still worth more than half the modern stuff. So the second way in which planning can absolutely muck it up, and this is the point I made at the beginning, this is the one point I want you to remember, so all the rest was just small change. This is the big one. We have a very, 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 very strange planning system. Look at the name, happily translated for you on the right, of the key permit that you need, I think in almost every country in Europe. In every country other than the UK and Ireland, which has taken, foolishly for them, our lead, it's a building permit. And that leads to a really important point, because our local plans are policy documents. The local plan in most of the world, including much of the States, France and the States are actually more similar to each other than they are to us on this, much of the world is a regulatory document. It sets what you can and can't do. So if we can predict what people will like, if we can predict what's worth more, if we can predict where people tend to be happier, which we increasingly can, not perfectly, we should be able to set the constraints for this type of conventional, high-density, walkable, health-inducing urbanism. The Well, actually, I'll jump over that. And I'll jump over that. So our point would be, and we used to do this, by the way. Both the right and the left talks about the 47 Town and Country Planning Act. Either it's a good or a bad thing, but as the key moment, and they're completely wrong. We've been regulating the built environment since before the Romans. There's evidence, well, the Romans did it, there's evidence the Anglo-Saxons did it. The first extant planning document in London is from 1187, banning thatch. Very sensible, thatch is a fire risk. In the 19th century, in response to this type of courtyard housing, there was a series of very important public health acts, which almost nobody knows about, the 1848, 58, and 75 public health acts, which set what you could build. So the reason when you go around, they were then controlled locally. The reason, if you go around many towns in England, that you can, that so many things are built on the same form. They're not identical, but they're built with the same back-to-back or street width, is because they were just responding to regulation. Our current system is much less predictable. And the very important consequence of that, and I'm going to stop here, I promise,
right,
the very, very important consequences, and this is the crucial point, the very important point of that, is in order to take the planning risk and the cost that we currently have and push your way through, you have to be a big player with access to capital. The share of self-build and custom build in the UK is about 10. The share that's taken up by big players is much, much higher than the rest of the country. So if we can move, and now I'm stopping, I promise, Ollie. I said I'd be hard to shut up, though. If we can move to a planning system that gives more certainty, but in a way that links to what is provably popular and provably better for us, then we will not just be bringing beauty into the planning system, we'll be helping create more places and healthier citizens. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for that. Great. Many thanks, Nicolas. We'll have to invite you back for the hour-long version of that slideshow. Next up, we have Alpa Depani from Public Practice.
This one, right? Hi. So the question that I've been asked to speak on tonight is, does beauty have a role in the planning system? And my answer is, no. The Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission has stated that its purpose is to tackle the challenge of poor quality design. But the Commission defeats itself from the start with the inclusion of the word beautiful, because beauty, on its own, is the wrong metric for determining the value of architecture. Just to be clear about definitions, while beauty refers to an aesthetic pleasing of the senses, this commission is really only talking about the sense of sight, about physical appearance. The Minister for Housing, Kit Malthouse, he of the doomed compromise, has stated he has assembled this commission because he wants to produce stuff that looks fantastic. But judging whether something looks fantastic is too subjective, and judging architecture on looks alone is simply wrong. Because the thing about buildings is we don't just have to look at them, we have to use them. We have to live our lives around them and in them. So designing a building or development for the eye alone disregards a substantial proportion of what a building is for. Good design can result in beauty, in pleasure that appeals to all the senses, but the pursuit of physical beauty in of itself does not necessarily imply good design. That is because good design is about more than the end result. Good design, of which planners are undoubtedly custodians, needs to be better understood as a process rather than a product. Once we emphasize design as a verb, not a noun, it becomes clear that what we should really be evaluating when we discuss good design is not looks, style, or taste, but intention, time, and care. In life, we're taught to go beyond looks in our evaluation of people. Beauty, we're told, is only skin deep. Well, judging buildings on skin alone is rather futile, and it leads directly to the dysfunctional preoccupation with development that is in keeping. That is, judging something on how well it copies the skin of its neighbour rather than how well it is designed. And this is something that, as a planner, I see time and time again. I worked for several years as an architect before becoming part of the first cohort of Public Practice, a social enterprise that places built environment experts within the public sector with the aim of improving the quality and equality of everyday places. Now that I work for a local planning authority, I've gone from designer to arbiter of design, and from that vantage, I'll give you an example of the trickle-down effect of prioritising appearance in the design process. I reviewed an application for a block of 14 flats recently, and I started, as I always do, by reading the design and access statement, which is the document prepared by the architect describing the project and the key design drivers. And the design and access statement for this project said it was taking as its, quote, architectural leads, it was taking its architectural leads from a neighbouring block of flats, Renaissance Court. What could this masterpiece be, I wondered? Just to be clear, my heart didn't sink when I saw this building because I am a modernist-loving snob who hates pitch roofs. My heart sank because this Renaissance Court is clearly not the culmination of the time and care implicit in good design. I know this because it offers so little response to the streetscape, because it lacks a human scale, because it comprises a set of cheap materials that have been put together without much thought, and because it has a hostile boundary treatment and an unlovely green space that is usable by no one. And yet the appearance of this building, regardless of its objective or subjective beauty, was being used as a benchmark for a new proposal. Why? Because there's not much else around to base it on, is what my planning officer colleague replied. Which is not true. To the south is a huge park, and to the north is a handsome parade of shops providing plenty of inspiration for scale, massing, rhythm, quality of materials, and careful application of those materials. But these things were not mentioned in the design and access statement as architectural leads because, I realised, the proposal was not interested in responding to its context, or even in understanding that context is more than the building right next to you. And it was not interested in demographic because it proposed 1- and 2-bed flats in an area needing family-sized homes. And it wasn't even very interested in fulfilling its own brief of homes, good spaces for living in, because it presented awkwardly arranged, deep-planned, single-aspect flats with the view of the park given over to the bin store. The design of this building was simply based on aping the appearance of the nearest building. And by extension, a planning officer was willing to assess it on those same terms. And that is the approach you entrench by asking planners to appraise on beauty, whatever that might mean to an individual, rather than a robust design process. It's a prosaic example of how foregrounding exterior is no way to ensure design quality. It is only a way to ensure a steady, cancerous breeding of shit architecture. The planning system cannot regulate quality if it fixates on beauty. It must focus instead on design process, which incorporates a detailed brief, proper contextual reading, careful massing, vigorous space planning, considered use of materials, and attention to detail. No to beauty, yes to good design.
Many thanks, Alpa. Exactly within the 5 minutes, so bonus points there. Next up, we have Amin Taha.
I've chosen a precedent, if you like, our sort of struggle with planning. That goes back perhaps 300 years odd. So this is Edinburgh, for those of you who don't know. This is Edinburgh during the mid-17th century, packed with the burghers of Edinburgh beginning to struggle with its huge population. Some of them actually wanted to leave to London. So they devised a master plan for expanding the city in the fashion of the day, which is the neoclassical master plan, neoclassical aesthetic. So this is Edinburgh proper, the old town. That's what it looks like today, slightly cleaned up, so you can imagine at that time there's no proper sewage systems, everyone's burning coal, desperate to leave the tight old town, medieval old town. This is the new town, so this is designed in the mid-17th century, and the first people to invest in that, so this is all privately funded, began to build out the streets, set out the streets, and build the first housing, which are ultimately in a neoclassical fashion. Bit of a shock to the burghers of Edinburgh at that time, the wealthy burghers, and the developers, effectively went bankrupt. They couldn't sell a single one. No one was interested in moving into this new fashion. They wanted to stay in this, which is perfectly acceptable to us today when we see it cleaned up. It took another generation, their children effectively, being brought up in the sort of what by that stage was called the Enlightenment, to accept, you can see fashions have changed, to accept the scale of the rooms, the architectural language and its detailing, and begin to move into this, into these streets. I mean, here, this is obviously a more recent photo, so it's weathered a bit, discolored a bit from its brand new stone colours. And today, most of us would find that beautiful, acceptable, love it to some degree, don't we? So that's the Greek style. So the new town expanded into 3 phases. Everything was built in the Greek style. So you can imagine initially it was a bit of a shock, too regular. Everything. So this is galleries, schools, all in the Greek style. So at some point, you can imagine where I'm heading. The next generation eventually want to rebel, architects as well as inhabitants. And the new gallery that's built, so by this time we have Pugin and Morris and Ruskin suggesting that the Greek is a burgeoning in the sort of in religion, suggesting the Greek is a bit pagan, not very Christian. Why don't we bring back the Gothic Christian? And this is it's a bit sort of Venetian Doge's Palace, the Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh. And that eventually translates into individuals knocking down their Greek-style houses and building in the Gothic revival, even some of the smallest buildings there. I suspect if we were planners today, or back then with the same rules, obviously we wouldn't allow that. Definitely isn't in keeping, is it? Ultimately, what happens with all those changes from the Greek, the Roman, the Gothic revival, is we end up with a World Heritage Site now, where even some today's contemporary buildings are struggling to sort of fit in, as it were. But how do we... This is an example I think one of our previous speakers was looking at in Holland, who perhaps have reached a level of freedom in their planning. So this is, again, medieval, going into sort of what we might call the classical Renaissance, where each one is individual. There's some commonality there, which we can, a thread of commonality which we can pick out. But ultimately, each one of those merchants is building their own house and expressing it individually. What have they done with the new town? So again, fashions have changed. Those are the fashions of the day. Here are fashions today, much more varied, lots of diversity. Do the Dutch restrict that in terms of their architectural language as well? No, they say, okay, we're all of a human scale, roughly the same height. Here, they seem to have chopped an absolutely uniform height, but everybody's allowed to do their own thing. It seems to work. In some of the streets, they've allowed some other diversity. So my conclusion is that today, we shouldn't be looking at beauty as a metric, as you described, that we impose on architects, individuals, because ultimately, there's plenty of diversity. And if you pull back far enough, we're all pretty much roughly the same scale and roughly the same to look at. That's the conclusion.
Brilliant vision of diversity there. Thank you, Amin. Next up, we have Deirdre Armsby from Westminster City Council.
Okay, well, you've seen what I was going to say, so I'll just sit down now. Sort of very exhausting, which is sort of the theme of my first slide, which is this is the poor planners after their deliberations about beauty. They're all very exhausted. Although I actually, having heard Nicolas's insults to planners, I decided this is what he's done to them by being so rude. But anyway, what is beauty? What is beauty in the public eye? I think, I was looking at the top 5 visitor attractions, and I thought it was really enlivening, actually, that they are a mixture of styles, but actually what it's all about, it's not so much about the beauty of a building, but if you like, the beauty of what goes on inside it. People go there within a certain setting where that it's easy to get to, which goes to the whole sort of connectivity stuff about where someone's set. But actually, it's all about experiences. And in those top 5, you know, you've got the learning experiences, you've got people viewing art, you've got people in looking at shows and so on. And I just think that's brilliant that there's such an eclectic range of things there for the public and the human spirit to be seeking. And I think that emotional power of beauty is so very strong in keeping those type of places with those eclectic experiences and appearances very much in everybody's top 5 list. And I think that power of beauty within everything that we create, both in what buildings do for us as well as what they look like, you know, attaches us to our place. And I think that's a really important part of the debate. So obviously, you know, here we have classic sort of National Gallery, and contained therein is some fantastic art and some great experiences for everyone. And this is now being brought out into lots of places in the city. And this actually is a development in Victoria, which has Frida nicely placed on the wall of a Grade 2 listed building. And it's also done its job in terms of creating space with landscape beauty. I mean, beauty may be a little bit too strong for that, to be fair, but it's just to demonstrate that it's about a range of things. It's not just the bricks and mortar, it's the place and some of the other parts of it. I think the planning system does a really important job. I mean, if you think about it, from when somebody starts to think about a proposal, be it, you know, a large-scale master plan in places like the Olympic Village or, you know, down to individual infill developments in Islington or in Croydon or in Westminster, you know, what the system gives you is a time to pause and think about where it's come from. That proposal may well be 18 months old, from a brief from a landowner to an architect, discussions, some pauses while funding's found, etc. And eventually it comes to the planning system. And I think that it's a worthy part that it plays in having that step back, to pause, to look at what it is, to put it out into the public domain, which is what it does, and it may never otherwise go there if there wasn't a system such as we have. And I think, you know, it gives us that opportunity to look at what we've got. Will this add to it? Is it good? Does it do a good job for us in providing homes that are affordable across the piece, or places of work, places of entertainment? And I think that, you know, that the whole combination of function, form, and what we've got and what we want to have, I think the system does a really good job for that. And at the end of the day, this massive exposure of everything that we do here, it is hung on a wall, you know, it's visible. There is very few planning proposals that don't have public visibility. Be they public buildings in themselves, but even private buildings, they're used by people. It's all about how people perceive them, and that's why the participation element of the planning system and the exposure is very, very important, and I think it's something that we can't lose. But within that, I think the idea of beauty, and people may not articulate it that way, is very much already, and always has been, part of the system. And I think, you know, the system goes from, you know, those big buildings, those big, you know, grand projects, to the very small, you know, the whole sort of design piece around London Underground. You know, we see it every day, we experience it really well. This is quite compromised by the post, but, you know, at the end of the day, it's iconic. I hate to use that word, but, you know, I think that is a beautiful thing, but not everybody will agree with me in terms of that definition of beauty. But this just shows you, you know, small things matter, because they're the places, these sort of suburban areas are often, they're where we live. They're what we experience every day. And a lot of people, somebody advised me some years ago, if you're ever buying a handbag that you use every day, make sure it's a thing of beauty. And it goes back a bit to your previous talk with that everyday beauty concept. And I do strongly believe in that. You have to see beautiful things in your everyday life. So Nicolas touched on this, you know, there is a massive history of regulation in this country. It's not going to go away. In many ways, it's sort of what we've often been known for around the world. But I think where it's going to now is it's a little less around individual buildings, much more focus on place and how things fit into neighbourhoods and what they do for those neighbourhoods. But the other thing to bear in mind is whatever we say about how we will beautify proposals for the future, most of what is beautiful for us is what exists now. We are not going to build another 200% of London in the next 50 years. We'll maybe build another 5 to 10% of it. So we have to live with what we've got today, and how we adapt that and perhaps make that more beautiful is probably a much more important point. I mean, specifically around design guidance, etc., the whole mantra for the last 20 years has been about streamlining, and you could argue that has given much more freedom to designers and people interested in creating good places. And that feeling that you can go there a bit further because you're not so prescribed, which I know is not necessarily what some of the speakers would advocate, but there's also a risk with that if you're not told so precisely what to do that you end up with that oxymoron of bland chaos. You know, it could be very much a non-entity, so we need to be careful. And I think some of the proxies that come into the system instead of very prescribed guidance are things like design review, place review, and a much stronger public voice. And I think those are really good things because they're freer entities that allow much more debate, and they allow it and promote it very much earlier on in the process, which I think is a really good thing. And the other sort of note of caution I'd put to this is, yes, we are capable, as we have demonstrated through history and today, that we can create things of beauty, but there's a big issue around how we look after what we've got and how public resources are there in sufficient numbers to deal with this regulatory process that we have. And that goes to local authority funding and how the right talent is within those sorts of sectors in order that we get the job done in the correct way. So our future, I think it's about adaptable buildings. We've talked about this, adaptable places, different functions. You know, we've just worked very, very hard on our Oxford Street project. That's all about reinvention and the future and loosening up some of the ways that we've perceived those places in the past and enabling them to do more of things that we never imagined they would do as a high street for the future. But, you know, these type of straightforward buildings, this is Hampstead Theatre, but, you know, it could equally be proposed to be converted into offices, it could be a community centre, it probably could be housing. And I think that's very much where we're going to be going. There's also still space for the more outlandish forms of beauty. And I don't think that's a bad thing because, you know, variety, eclecticism, it makes our world much more interesting. And these, starting from the beginning with the sleeping planner, these are the planners contemplating how they get beauty right in the end. Thank you.
Fantastic. Many thanks, Deirdre. And for any developers in the audience, outlandish forms of beauty are very welcome in Westminster. Finally, over to Grayson Perry.
Oh, hello. Yes, hello. Your Chancellor, but also the least qualified person here this evening. And we've had 4 very expert planning architecture people. I'm not that bad. Here is me with Charles Holland dressing up as Scandinavian architects. I'm actually dressed up as the imaginary person that inspired the House of Essex, Julie. And I thought that as she was a social worker, she would wear Gudrun Sir Joden clothes that you see every week advertised in The Guardian. But yes, we were commissioned, me and Charles were commissioned by Living Architecture to design one of their houses. If people don't know, they basically give free rein to an architect and say, design what you would like, and we will rent it out to the public as a holiday let. And it's a nice idea, and I'd been talking to Alan de Botton for years about building a church. And he said, well, why don't you do it as a house? So then he put me in contact with Charles Holland. And this is probably the time that I was most exposed to the planning system. But I had built a studio in the country, which is quite a nice building. I haven't got a slide of it, unfortunately. But I remember the architect at the time saying to me, if you want to get around the planning, what you do is you build a feature onto the plan that is really in your face. And then the planners will look at that. So we put this massive chimney on my studio that I didn't want or need. But he said what they'll do is they'll make you knock that chimney down. They won't notice that you've got the wrong kind of guttering and the wrong kind of, you know. So if any architects out there, you know, it's about distraction technique. But we couldn't really do that because the way, you know, the way we designed the house for Essex, it wasn't going to be something that we could hide because we wanted it to be a totally unusual. It's a little kind of jewel box of a house. It's quite small, but it's also a kind of wayside chapel to an imaginary woman. This is the kind of cross-section of it. And I wanted it to be like one of those sort of Russian churches where it looks like everything's been added to it. And Charles, he was the architect, he said at one point, because I'd done some very kitsch sort of preliminary sketches, he said, I'm going to bring some architectural dignity to this, which was a great thing. And what his basic idea was that it was like a series of Russian dolls, really. So you've got the kind of motif of the two arch windows that get smaller and smaller as you start from the main room, the sort of chapel room on the right, goes through to the bedrooms and kitchen, and then to the kind of entrance hall, and then finally the one on the end is the bathroom overlooking. And that's what it looks like. And it looks like a spaceship. And that, when we'd finally finished building it, I remember showing a picture that I'd just taken of the completed house to one of the builders. And he said, yeah, I've seen the computer rendering. I said, no, that's a photograph of the house. Because it does look like it's been sort of photoshopped into the landscape. So the idea of in-keeping wasn't really in our minds when we made it. And I think right from when we made our first suggestion of it to the local planning authority, to the council, they were really, really keen that we would build a landmark in the area. You know, they really wanted that kind of, you know, the fact that the path, there's the Essex Way footpath. This is taken practically from the Essex Way, this photograph. So you see this house as you're walking along by the side of the River Stour. So they really wanted a landmark there. But when it came to, we put in the planning application, we decided we'd be really, really low-key about it, you know, and we'd just put it out there and then see what happened. Of course, as we've found with Brexit, the neggy people tend to be the ones who get off up their arses. You know, let's face it now, if all the Remainers had had the energy they now have and they'd had it before the bloody referendum, we might not have had the same result. But of course, what happened was our planning got rejection at the first attempt because the only people who bothered to go to the website and write anything on there were the people who were saying, oh, it's an eyesore, it's not like my Barrett house. I mean, Rabness, where it's built, is not exactly an architecturally distinguished area. You know, it's a load of sort of 60s, 70s and a few Victorian cottages. It's a scrappy little hamlet with a railway station. Hasn't even got a pub. So what we did, we just went back to the village. We didn't alter the design one tiny bit. We just went back to the village and we did a PR campaign on it. And we did a lecture. We had a public meeting. We just talked about it. And we just got, and most people were keen on it. And then it just got through. End of. That's how we did it. So we didn't buckle down to any, because we knew the goodwill of the local authority was there. It was just a few neggy people. You know, and we got the locals to go to the website and they let it through. And now it's loved. I mean, they don't like the fact that a lot of people come to look at it, but, you know, it is a much-loved local landmark now, and it sits there like an alien spaceship on the edge of the River Stour with all of its thing. And I'm very proud of it, and that's what it looks like inside. And it works very well. And when you go to stay there, you can listen to Julie's record collection and read her books while you're sitting in the kind of chapel to her. Now, I just thought I'd quickly, while I've got the opportunity to berate architects and planners, I'll go through a few of my random few of the things that really annoy me. Because obviously I like decorative things, There's a few kind of buildings that have a nod to decoration. It's like kind of decorative light. It's like they're a bit scared of being really decorative. So you see buildings like this, and this particular sort of style of decoration is like decoration when you can't really think of anything to decorate it with. It's kind of lowest common denominator decorative motif. I call it the vestigial swirl. You see it on packets of sanitary pads. So it's like a kind of man's idea about what a woman wants. You see it like women's motorbike jacket, look, has got the vestigial swirl on it. You can be a bit more imaginative than that, than a little curly-whirly, you know. The other thing I've got to think is, I think one of the things the planners could do is keep an eye on trends so they don't bore us shitless. Wood and rust. London has been dominated now. It's like wood and rust are the beards of buildings. As the hipster movement have swept across East London, the buildings have grown beards made out of wood and rust. You can basically tell, you know, where's gentrification is travelling across London because of, you know, little bits of now rotting woodwork hanging onto the sides of cheap flats and rusty panels because they're so authentic. Also, I think minimalism is now kitsch. Because, you know, it used to be that when people wanted a dream house, they wanted a cottage or a Georgian terrace or something like that. Now they've all watched grand designs and they all want a glass box. I think it's boring and kitsch, and I think what I really want to come down to. This was when I was working with a gang of young men that got into trouble with the police a lot, dealing drugs up in Skelmersdale, and this is how they marked their territory, right? What an odd way to mark your territory with a great big cock, eh? Yeah, exactly. I mean, planners, hold your heads in shame now. I'm pointing, of course, at the walkie-talkie, probably the ugliest building to fuck up a scale line anywhere in the world. I mean, there is something, and what gets me about a lot of these buildings is, and one of our previous speakers mentioned it, and I think it's a very good point, is they all look the bloody same if you're only 10 metres away. They're buildings designed where the original model was looked on a tabletop, and they only look good from a bloody helicopter. You know, I've been to Norman Foster's house in Geneva, okay, and in there he's got a chapel laid out with all of the models of his major iconic buildings, you know, some of which are great buildings, of course. But, you know, that's how they look at these buildings. They don't look at them like the bloke who's having a fag outside the front. You know, they're grey metal, basically. Everything is grey metal. And I think, you know, you could have some thoughts about that. And the other thing is the sort of masculinity of it. You know, when I made a TV series about masculinity, I looked at the men of the city, and I went to a lot of buildings with foyers like this. And it was like walking into a series of overblown teenage bedrooms of boys. You know, there was something very machismo about them, and the sort of dominant aesthetic of the urban landscape was very male. You know, as if the sort of, you know, decorativeness was, you know, that would be too frilly. I mean, I put this slide up. This is where I got married. This is Finsbury Town Hall. And it's not that I'm sort of holding it up as a fantastic, great building, though it is a building I love, because it looks like a load of buildings that have been rammed together. And I think other speakers have talked about this. And I think one of the things, if we're going to have beauty in the landscape, in our urban landscape particularly, is variety. And I think one of the great things I noticed when I came to London 35 years ago for the first time to live here was that you could walk down the street and there would be buildings from every decade of the 20th century, if not the 19th century, if not the 18th century, in one street. And it's increasingly becoming grey metal and glass. And it worries me now, you know, that even if you've got a shitty Edwardian building, maybe leave it there and do it up, because that variety is what makes London a fantastic place to live. I mean, of course, there are places, you know, nice Georgian areas of London that are very beautiful, but I think the main thing we need to retain is A, there is the human scale thing that looks nice from the street, and B, that there's variety. And of course, it's got to operate as well. I think, you know, the idea that they're functional is also incredibly important as well. That's me. I'm an ignoramus on these things. Thank you all.
Fantastic. Could I, thank you so much, Grayson. Could I invite all our speakers to join me on stage in the order that you've spoken, please?
All right. So where am I? I'm on this
Yeah, you're on that one. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think you were first. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for a brilliant range of provocative presentations. Can I be very boring and bring it back to the nitty-gritty of the planning system itself? In terms of, as Nicolas said earlier on, the UK planning system is almost unique in its structure in that it's a kind of negotiative system. We don't have black and white regulations. They're kind of policy ambitions and guidance that it's down to the individual planning officer for their own kind of personal interpretation of these very vague principles. Is it too vague as it stands? Should we be moving towards a stricter, maybe zoning-based system with slightly clearer, proper rules that can be enforced? Nicolas.
It's really, thank you very much. And thank you also to all my fellow speakers. I mean, it's really interesting the examples that came up of Edinburgh Newtown, Java Island in Holland, which Amin was showing, and Edwardian London. The way we used to regulate the built environment, the way either through city governance or through public health acts or through the landowner in Edinburgh or through the way it's done in Java Island or the London Metropolitan Acts when the Edwardian, I keep getting Edinburgh and Edwardian confused, buildings produced was, we were much stricter on some things. So it's interestingly, Amin showed when he was talking about the house types in Edinburgh Newtown, you actually showed 3 images of 3 houses from a book by a man called Peter Nicholson in 1826, the House Builder's Manual. What that was a response to the 1778 London Housing and Building Act, which said, this is the width of different types of house you can build, this is the height, this is what you need to do in terms of anti-fire acts, this is, actually didn't, but then Metropolitan Acts put things about street to width ratio. So it set some things incredibly strictly. And all the other stuff just didn't touch. Now, I'm talking here about sort of, if you like, normal streets. I think, an iconic building, a chapel in the middle of the countryside is a different thing. But, for the normal, for the ordinary, I would advocate, and I'm very sorry, by the way, if you thought I was being rude about planners. I was trying to be rude about the system, not about the individual. I really wasn't. We should be incredibly strict on some things most of the time. There should be pressure cooker clauses because we need to do weird and wonderful buildings. But that within that very tightly constrained carapace, we should just let planners, developers, the market, individual choice do its thing. And the Java Island example is really interesting there because what happens in much of Holland is, what they tend to do, they tend to set the width of the street, the bay width, the height. Some developments like Java Island are then very flexible, basically do whatever you like within that. Other ones are rather more controlling, and that, I would argue, is something that should be controlled at the local level. So if there's a town or a village that wants to be more strict in terms of material facade pattern, I would let them do that. If there are others, like in Java Island, who want to just let it go, let it go. But just allow ourselves to take out the planning risk by having some things constrained. And by the way, the key thing, we've done research on why people oppose building, and there are lots of reasons why people oppose buildings, from the good, the bad, to the indifferent. But the thing that runs through all of it is risk, is lack of certainty. There's a very high degree of mistrust, both, I have to say, of developers and of the planning system, and a legitimate, in some cases, concern that they'll say this, they'll put this in, but then, gosh, what will they do? How will they change it? How will they get away with it? So, control in on that, and that's the way to do it. So that was
more certainty, yeah.
More certainty on the right things.
Yeah, I mean, that is a good point. The UK planning system, as I understand it, I haven't been in it for very long, so I feel a bit of an imposter. But there's a lot of space in it for judgment, for personal judgment from the planner. And given that, I don't think it's fair to kind of ask planners to make a judgment on appearance alone. So we should have more guidance. I think guidance is good. And there's kind of a lot of guidance is being updated at the moment. A lot of design guidance that's coming out is quite different in format to the way it's been in the past. There's a lot more examples in it. It's less on kind of exact distances. It's more kind of, I don't know, giving examples of what could be good design. And I think we should throw it back to the applicant to make sure the design process is robust rather than ask planners to kind of judge on just the final appearance. And they should be, investing in that design process by relying on the guidance that planning authorities put out.
Amin, what do you make of the current system?
Well, I think most people are interested in, when they talk about beauty, they're interested in the skin and the facade. They're not really interested in the areas that you're defining as beauty, which I think are key. for both of you, which is everything else that's within the building, and as you experience the building, as you approach it, its adjacencies with pavement, etc. Everything else that makes that building function internally, as well as its presence on the street and how we relate to it. If the architect has the correct intentions from the beginning, and that's perhaps demonstrated in the design and access statement, but also in the design process, then whatever the result is, it might be highly innovative and alien, and that was my point with the Edinburgh example. It initially will be rejected. Highly likely it'll be rejected by the public, as it were, who are interested in beauty. There, the innovation was that the classical was turning what's effectively temple architecture into domestic architecture. So Palladio had obviously done it for the very wealthy, but it's the first time somebody was beginning to turn it into streets. For us all.
So you're happy with the current flexibility and that allows a range of approaches?
I'm happy with general policies. I'm unhappy with the quality of planners in some boroughs.
Which ones do you have in mind?
Yes.
Well, I'll be. After doing this for many years in London and elsewhere, I think it's since, and you have to correct me, I think it's since boroughs were allowed to keep their own income as opposed to distributing it. Some boroughs lost. Is this sort of
what income?
The housing revenue accounts?
No, well.
Do you mean new homes bonus?
No, sorry, bear with me. Let's start from scratch. All council taxes that might go to pay towards borough facilities such as planning departments. So if you're in Kensington, Chelsea, and you walk into a planning department, or even Westminster, it's like looking into a red brick university. While if you go off to further parts, I think in 2002 was my first application in Hackney, and that building was verging on a ruin with people practically sleeping in doorways, and the poor planning team was reduced to a small skeleton staff that absolutely struggled.
Yeah, that was financial because they lost £80 million from something else. So that was probably not a good example because the council was corporately in a terrible position. So,
there are still some boroughs that struggle with their staff compared to others. You can have fantastic, intelligent conversations in some boroughs, and others they'll be telling you, "Oh, it's very Corbusian," and that's it.
Deirdre, are you happy with the system as it stands?
Well, look, I think one point I would make, we talked about the system in a way as if it's a sort of unilateral, independent, technical entity, and it is not. It is a political system. You know, the plan that we've talked about and the regulation that's national is clearly made by central government, and within it you will see over time the different colours of different governments as they've made new regulation. And likewise, a local plan in an area is part of, it's a product of that local authority at that point in time. And I'd also emphasise that, those processes are all subject to public consultation, as is an end result of a planning application. So there is a strong democratic seam in all of that. And there is a point about those who choose to take the opportunity and whether it's mostly those who oppose things and those that support don't necessarily step up. And you gave a very good example of that. So lots of the conversations that are had are not as, they're not necessarily all about planners and the system. They are the system that they have to work in. I think the system at the moment is sufficiently flexible to encourage and appreciate beauty/good design. I think where it's stuck in the mire is with too much information attached to many, many planning applications. Let's face it, probably on some relatively large schemes, the promoters team don't have a handle on all the van load of information they deliver to us. We really don't have the time to read every single piece of it. We might have 5 different people, you know, reading the component parts of it. But the idea that, you know, all that information is then accessible to the public and they really get what you're trying to do. Design and access statements, you know, do they do it on one page? No. You know, and I think that is a real barrier to the system of people's understanding of it.
So you'd be in favour of simplification and streamlining? I'm
totally in favour of simplification. I'm not really in the place, having worked in a system when it was more prescriptive in terms of regulation. I don't think that the quality of what we have now has suffered from some fluidity in the regulation. I'm not really keen on zoning. My examples of zoning are countries like Australia and America, and I don't think they're good adverts.
Grayson, how did it work for you, the planning system?
What are your views on zoning, particularly? I'm sure you want to talk.
What do you exactly mean by zoning? Like everything has to be a certain thing in a certain zone?
Many other countries have a much more black and white system, so the developer knows what they'll be able to get away with. And our system is famously vague, so you can, you know, put in for a 50-storey tower and hope for the best.
Well, I think there's a bit of what everyone has said. You know, the planner should listen to the whole panel. You know, and that there's good things that you've got to have an overview of the city you're in, so you have variety and human scale and functionality. And then the individual buildings need to have the things like the internal spaces. I mean, I love the quote about when don't call a garden, because there's so much waste of open space in London that it's just dog poo and gangs, you know. So it's just wasteful. And I think that, you know, the dealing with the public, you know, democracy has terrible taste. And so you can't just all, I think it's true. You do not put beauty out to a public vote. You know, we're here at an art college. I'm sure you lot have got brilliant taste, you know, because you're the elite of aesthetic people in the country. But, you know, a lot of people's idea of beauty is what they're used to. As, you know. But
that's as it should be, because where you want to live and spend time, some degree of something that is familiar to you, for most of us, is psychological.
It's a component of beauty, but it is not the component of beauty.
It's not all of beauty.
You know, there's variety, there's pattern, there's texture, there's surprise. There's all different parts of beauty. And you can't rely on, oh, it's just like what I like, you know, and regulate, you know, that it all looks like Prince Charles's loo.
What does Prince Charles's loo look like? I don't know.
Is there a kind of dogma of everything being in keeping, do we think?
Yeah, that's
is that the problem with the planning system as it stands, or do we want more in keeping?
Most of the great architectural wonders of the world would never have got through planning because they're higgledy-piggledy. You know, Amin gave the example of Edinburgh. You know, look at Venice or, you know, any of these great places. They're really higgledy-piggledy, a bit of this and a bit of that. And that's how what I think that makes a great city, is that variety. It's when you've got developers who, you know, they just want their bang for their buck and the function, and you've got these kind of macho techno architects who only go everywhere in a helicopter and look at the model on the table. You know,
I couldn't possibly comment about that. But it's very interesting and well-observed point that I think maybe particularly many female planners who've worked in London in the last 20 years would wholeheartedly agree with you on. But I think it's dangerous territory, isn't it? You know, in terms of working out who is an arbiter of beauty, because I would say, honestly, in my experience, in a range of different London boroughs, that, you know, local people they're local experts. You know, they are the big consumers of a borough that I might just be working in, and they are the ones that have the emotional attachments to their place. And I think it is important to listen to them. And you do get really varied points of view. And as long as you have good systems that reach to a broad church of your local people, your local experts, you will get, you know, you do get amazingly balanced points of view.
Nicolas, I mean, one of the premises of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission is that there should be some kind of consensus. You know, that we can channel popular taste into a product that everyone's going to agree with. how do you see that being manifest in the planning system, I suppose, is the question.
The elements of beauty, we've actually, all in our slightly different ways, I think have all touched on, and we're not maybe getting quite as much disagreement as you want. Variety in a pattern, human scale, some level of complexity. I would argue something that fits in, not necessarily is identical, but for most people most of the time. These are the types of element that, I'm sure I didn't have the data to put up to you, but when you look at people's brain waves and neurological patterns when they're shown certain images, the bits that bring pleasure and that show happiness do light up most in response to those things. And you were very articulate, Grayson, on everything is grey metal and these bland facades and shining and overscale. What's changed in the last 50 years, partly due to a modernist philosophy on town planning that was not empirical, but partly due to just what we can technologically do, and we can just now build things of a blandness and of a scale that we just couldn't really do 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, I should say, is that we are now able to create places that don't have those components, and crucially, it's cheaper to do it. Because the key thing that changed in production costs about 70, 80 years ago was that, particularly post-World War I, humans, in many ways it's a good thing, got more expensive. Machinery and technology and metalworking got cheaper and cheaper. So I think the brilliant example, Alpa, that you showed of the horrific Renaissance court, if by contextual, we're contextualizing to that, we've abandoned all sense of beauty. Because I can tell you now, did anyone find Renaissance court beautiful? I knew you'd say that. No one finds it beautiful. I guarantee no one finds that beautiful, including the people who walk in.
But I guess what I'm...
Hang on, let me just quickly try and answer in the last 30 seconds, I promise I should. So what we need to do is get to a system that isn't just does it fit in, but is one that is able, and I think all that the Building Better Beautiful Commission can do, and I'm speaking for myself now, not for it, is help set a framework which allows the interaction between, yes, local people, the democracy of taste, and people like you, and the developer and the landowners, to see the components that will make it very easy for things to be built and the things that will make it much harder. There needs to be a pressure cooker clause so that weird and exotic and strange and groundbreaking buildings can still be built through something more like the current planning system. But there needs to be a straight-through process for things that are more popular, have variety in a pattern, human scale, sense of enclosure, and that speak to the humans who live and spend time there. Alpa.
That's okay. I was just going to say that the point about that example is we don't need to appraise it on beauty to understand that it's not a good design. There are other ways of appraising it. But what I was going to say about in keeping and style, I mean, Create Streets have advocated a kind of definition of London-like neighbourhoods, but I don't know what that would be, because the point about London is that there is so much variety and there is a lot of trace of lots of different times and eras, and I don't think we would want to create lots more Georgian terraces because that would preclude something else happening. And if you design London-like, does that mean that you wouldn't get something like the Barbican, which has human scale, which has pedestrian streets, but it is not necessarily in keeping with Georgian terraces? So I wouldn't be in favour of kind of designing or defining what London-like would be, or the appearance of
I mean, we already have it in a way. We've talked about a plague of steel and glass, but I would say the current plague is the kind of stick-on brick wallpaper and the neo-Georgian windows. Is that the future? Is that the next plague?
Yeah, I mean, I think the trend thing, is a point well made. And if anyone thinks that planners sit in their planning departments across London thinking, oh, good, here's another building that looks the same, I can tell you that they don't. So,
I suppose the other end is Nova Victoria, which famously won the Carbuncle Cup in the city of Westminster.
Before my time.
Before your time, yeah.
Moving on.
But what do you think of it?
Would you allow it if it was to come forward now?
Oh, that is such an unfair question. I couldn't possibly comment, because that actually was allowed, obviously, through the democratic process of going through a planning committee. So it had it's got its virtues. I have used it because it's across the road from our offices, and it functions really well, actually. So if beauty was the only thing we were considering, then possibly it's a bit challenging. But if it's about function and the number of jobs that it provides, and the life it's put into that part of Victoria, it has done an exceptionally good job on that, most definitely.
I mean, I think you're well placed to speak about something being in keeping or not.
Yes. It slightly worries me that we can possibly look to future design by placing electrodes on people's heads and waiting for them to tell us whether they find it offensive or not, or comfortable. Because ultimately, anything strange, initially strange, will create that discomfort.
We loved it though, because me and my wife, we live near Clerkenwell Court. I mean, when we saw it going up, like, wow, I love that, it's fantastic.
Did you write in support of it, Grayson?
I'm glad you say that.
Well, I thought it was going up. I thought that was a done deal.
I'm not specifically talking about my building, but if we just look at social history, if we think of people, I mean, my parents, when they first came to this country, will tell you that people weren't being particularly odd about it, but they're odd in a certain way when they cross over the street and ask whether they could feel their skin, because they had never, met anybody of that particular colour or hair type, etc. And initially, it was odd to people. It takes some time to feel comfortable with them and become normalised with that diversity. I don't think today we'd find that odd anymore. No. And if we suggest that we need to analyse the future of design, urban design in that way, I'm very worried.
Do you think if we can get normalised to unusual beauty, we can also get normalised to unusual ugliness? Because that's the trouble, is that we've got used to some of the most dreary building. I mean, like, of new buildings that go up, what proportion of them are sort of like what in this room, if we were a democracy here, would vote as good? Probably not many. Most of them would be bland, boring, half copies of an architectural trend.
I think you made the point very, very well earlier on, which is it's not about just the skin, the appearance, the initial appearance. I think we recognise ugly immediately because not only its composition, but we have an innate feeling, especially the more trained we are, that this building is clearly not going to work on the inside. It certainly doesn't work in the urban landscape, and it certainly doesn't work on a street level, which is the most common way we all experience those buildings.
Right. But interestingly, quite often, I mean, there's a particular building which scores incredibly poorly, both with the general public and with, actually, I think with experts. I'm not going to say which it is, I don't want to be rude about the architect, but it's atrocious to the street. It was justified in terms of being in keeping because it's sort of painted orange. But it is justified, when you say, look, everyone hates this, which they do, it's rude to the street, it's justified in terms of the fact that the top floor has lovely light-filled windows, which I'm sure it does, looking back over the other side. So, absolutely, how a building works internally is incredibly important, but it is really possible to do something that works internally and that works externally.
Absolutely.
And we can't use one to justify offensiveness.
I totally agree with you, and I suspect most of the time we'd all agree. I only have difficulty with the idea that we're going to design a future based on people's current reaction.
Well, there's far too much cosy agreement on this panel, I would say. So it's time to open it up to some provocative questions from the audience. First hand was at the back left. The roving microphones could, on the raked seating.
Okay. I'd like to get back to the question of expert versus...
Could the second microphone go up?
Expert versus populism. And I'm struck by Nicolas's vilification of the expert on the back of a kind of populist wave, which, as we all know, is a very dangerous route to go down, because that's what Brexiteers have and still are doing. And I'm worried that in your version that you then support your populist argument on really bad expert research. I mean, the research that has been done, that you've done in relation to showing people pictures of buildings saying, do you like this or that, is about as bad a method as a Brexit referendum in trying to tease out complex issues. I'm really worried that we're being presented with a kind of binary between the expert and the popular voice through the work that you're doing. And therefore, I'm also, really interested in when Deirdre says about the democratic voice within the planning process. So my question is where does any voice of credibility arise from? Because clearly a planning committee is not a democratic voice. What anyone says, they've got a whole set of vested interests, and it is not a democratic voice. Clearly, the expert on its own, whether it is through some, I think, research which would not pass research methodologies in a university, or else the pure populist voice is not enough. So I'm interested in to hear from the panel where they think the voice may come from, which will determine these crucial things. Because I haven't heard anyone say, with any authority, apart from vague things about variety and human scale, about where that might come from.
Alpa.
Can I answer that? So I agree that we shouldn't attack experts. I'm in favour of the idea of designers and architects being experts in that field of design. And so I would say public practice, for example, is one way of bringing skills into the public sector, into public planning, where there has been a kind of drain of people that have got the skill, experience to really look at plans and drawings and really understand context. I'm not trying to denigrate planners, but there has been a kind of skills drain. And so, you know, public practice has been really good at getting people that are skilled and do want to enter the public sector, into the public sector. So I think that is one way of kind of increasing design scrutiny and the outcome.
Nicolas.
Thank you for your kind comments on our research. That was nice. Just on a point of fact, actually the research that I referred to was published in Nature magazine, the one, and some of our think tank papers, which publishes think tank papers, have actually been subsequently partially published as academic research. We've been approached by academic journals to publish them. So the vast majority of the research I cited, not quite all of it, was coming from peer-reviewed papers. But that said, I absolutely agree. You can't just judge, and I think I was trying to say this, I'm sorry if it didn't come over clearly enough, you cannot just judge a place and value it by its beauty, by what it looks like. But my point is that is important. It's just not the only thing that matters. It's part of a richer network, which I'm afraid we do, I think, all agree on, of how things interact. So, I think the data is clear and becoming clear about not specific what will always work in every situation, but the types of things that most people prefer, all of which in different ways I think we've reflected. Just on the democracy, if I may, for 2 seconds, we need to bring the democracy forward. I agree with you, after your first comments, which I found less agreeable. You're absolutely right that the planning committee does not function democratically. We need to bring the democracy into the plan-setting process. It's really interesting. If you look at the research on why people oppose development, in the rest of the world, I'm afraid I've only read it in America, Australia, New Zealand, and France, because I don't really know the languages, the debate happens when you're setting what we call the local plan, because that's the point of democratic importance. No one in this country, I'm exaggerating, because there are some, and I'm one of them, weirdos who do get interested, I count myself in that list, really cares about setting the Hammersmith and Fulham local plan or the London local plan. I think from memory, I may be wrong on this number, the London local plan is 576 pages. I wonder why. Yeah. And all of it contradicts itself. It is I won't say it's a useless document, but you can use section 2.1 to contradict section 3.4.
So how can we get people more involved? How can we make it an exciting democratic process?
You set it more clearly on some things so that people know they have to get involved.
Grayson, what would excite you to go and get involved in your local plan?
My experience is that, the art world, if the equivalent in the art world was, of the planners deciding what was beautiful, we'd have kind of like, the administrators at the gallery deciding what would be the whole of the art world, where it's a mixed, the jury is very mixed. There's different sorts of expertise and skill and passion at various levels. So, collectors, critics, curators, the public, they've all got a place to play. And so in a way, what you want is a kind of interested parties is the thing. Is that when I said democracy has terrible taste, is that if you did a sort of straw poll on the aesthetic merits of any given project, most of the public don't really care that much about it, Whereas if you get the interested parties who have looked at it, why people are experts at architecture or art is because they've looked at a shed load of it and they've had an opinion on it, and they've thought about it, they've talked about it. Whether they're experts or not, whether they're just someone who likes to visit interesting buildings at the weekend, people like that from the local area, they're the people you've got to be tapping into. And then maybe, local people who you've got people who are, interested in various aspects of the building. We are talking about beauty. That's why we keep banging on about it, because that's the name of the talk. But so I think that it's not this idea of complete open democracy. It's about finding people who have got an interest in it and a passion and a bit of experience. Because most people, I don't like that because they've never even thought about it until you ask them the question.
Deirdre, how do we get those people
involved?
involved?
I mean, I think there are, the system has all the tools to allow people to get involved. I think the point is well made that perhaps planners and planning authorities haven't really used the tools in the way that they could. And it really varies so much, but you know, what is the response rate on consultations on even planning applications when you've moved from the strategic in the plan about the ideas of how many houses you should have in an area over a 15-year period to a proposal trying to implement the, you know, spirit of the plan. That's where people get involved. And if they don't believe there should be any housing there, they should have been involved, as Nicolas said, quite rightly, at the beginning of the process. But the plans are 15-year documents. It's very, very hard for people to get their head around. And I think it's more incumbent on us to go to the interested parties, as you say. And that is about going to shopping centres, going to schools. You know, it's not about putting a notice.
Is that where you would find those people, though?
No, but
randomly in a shopping centre or a school?
You have to have that idea of what the big picture is. What do you want the area to be for 15 years? Everyone has got to have the opportunity to get involved in that. And after that, the bits of it that they're most interested in, they will be a self-selecting group. That is how the system works.
Amin?
Yeah, I think we're sort of cross purposes here. I think there's something called design review panels that most boroughs are beginning to adopt, which is the expert panel that looks at the final result, as it were, and can tell whether it's inside or to outside beautiful. Involving the public, the inhabitants of a local borough, is something that should occur at the outset of any design, and that way you'll take. Because that's the urban design scale, where you're doing a number of houses and streets, etc. And they'll actually inform the design. You had one of your previous speakers, Eliza Fior. I spent a very short time there before I set up on my own, and they really illustrate to you that consultation is not about wandering around with a clipboard and ticking boxes of predictable, you know, directions. It's much more actually letting people who live there actually inform the design.
Second question was back left.
Yeah. Just reflecting on what are the pressures which produce the clutch of giant phallic symbols that you see shooting up in London, and in this age of austerity, how local authorities have lost 40% of their former budget and are likely to lose a further 10%. Could the panel comment on the no doubt unintended consequences of 106 agreements, which I would suggest are acting as a bribe towards allowing densification?
Unintended consequences of Section 106 agreements. Who wants to tackle that first?
I'll say something very quick, because I'll speak too much otherwise. I mean, Section 106 is bonkers in the way it works. SIL is much better conceived, Community Infrastructure Levy. There should be a very clear mandated requirement of payment to the public authorities, you know, for development in a certain area. That is something that is democratically set within, probably arranged, controlled ultimately by central government. And it is up to local governments, you know, to what degree they use that for social housing or whatever they wish to do. You know, that should just be a number, and that is the tax that you pay when you're buying land or developing, and you know what it is. Section 106, and I've been involved in several negotiations on them, not normally working for community groups on partially on the outside, are tortuous, labyrinthine. They end up literally sometimes hundreds of pages long. It is impossible to, you know, get your head around them if you're anything other than a very expert and complex planning lawyer. Even then, I'm not sure they understand them. I know for a fact that many officials involved in them don't read the whole damn things, and it has got out of democratic control. It is absolutely right that you charge a betterment levy or tax on development, and that some of the value from development comes back to the public sector. But setting it through this, you know, infinitely negotiable process, where the people with the best lawyers always win, is insane. And we should get back again to a clearer, simpler percentage set number.
I think that they are complex, but they are often the most interesting part of planning proposals from a local perspective, because they are the things that define what the local benefits are. I mean, I think that any planning application or planning proposal should stand alone, and that the idea that you then put some of the things that you should do to make that acceptable in a side document, it is really contradictory. It shouldn't get planning permission if it doesn't do all its jobs on affordable housing, on, you know, local public space, etc. So I think lots of the things that should be in the main proposal have just been filtered off into something that's negotiable when it shouldn't be negotiable. It should be straight up what you need to do. But they are very much part of the system now, and I think there's been lots and lots and lots of changes to them over the last 5 or 6 years in particular, and it looks like they're here to stay. I think that they're not... I think the questioner was sort of perhaps indicating that they act like some sort of bribe. I think that that's somewhat harsh because what they contain is the ability to pay for local benefit and do some very concrete things, if you pardon the pun. And, you know, that's it. I mean, they're not paying for anything other than those things that are there to make developments acceptable.
Just briefly, Amin and Alpa.
One very useful thing I found in Section 106 is that beginning to tie the architect into the actual proposal. Yeah. Now, one question. That's a bunch of boroughs are slowly getting there. Why is Westminster still not there?
Well, I have taken over the town planning service for only 6 weeks. So, so one of a number of things. But I would assure you that we used to do that in Newham, where we could.
Briefly, Alpa.
I agree with what you're saying. It shouldn't be a negotiation, but the problem is not Section 106. The problem is that there's just like an absence of central government funding. So that's, you know, that's what it becomes. It becomes a way of the local authority to get the things that the local authority needs.
But it's not strange to charge a tax on development. I think it's a legitimate place to tax, which is because, you know, land value getting permission is something that comes from the public sector, and I think the public sector should take something back. So your point about
through a land value tax, but that's a whole other debate which we had.
If you're building.
Series. The question in the middle there.
Hi, Grayson. Although I admire a lot of the things you've been saying, I do think you need to be pulled up on the fact that the areas where you stereotype areas with gangs and dog poo, etc. I think you need to go on some of the estates and walk around, and you'll see there are not loads of gangs and people running around lawlessly, and they've got poo bags actually, and they're recyclable. Right? And the next thing, Amin, I totally agree with you. You was talking about diversity, which is really, really good to be inclusive of a community that is London, that is reflective of London and reflecting the architecture and the diverse architecture in London. And Nicolas, I think you're really, really good at quoting statistics and all the surveys. I do wish you would just live in a sort of affordable housing area and then go back and try and incorporate that into some of the statistics that you've been quoting. And Deirdre, I love the way that you've actually come to terms with the fact that, yes, there is a lot going on in London, but we need a lot more for the people who are being developed around to be included in the whole process, especially in Westminster.
Great. We'll have the question there, and then one at the back right.
Oh, was that not a question?
There was no clear question.
All right.
No, more of a provocation.
Sometimes people say, well, if that ugly, tall building was full of affordable apartments that people actually lived in, would you like it? And in a way, you could say yes, because the urgency is about the fact that these buildings are not really, they're symbols of greed and not what people want. So maybe the use of a building and whether it's been democratically conceived and is democratically used can result in beauty.
Would we put up with
Go to one of those Chinese megacities where you see kind of rank upon rank of identical blocks going off to the horizon. I'm sure the people, you know, they're housing all the people in a very democratic way. I don't know how.
But going to what Alpa said about the building looks ugly because it's badly designed. I mean, if a building does have is designed well and is being used properly, then perhaps it's beautiful. It ends up beautiful.
Would we forgive ugliness if a building has a good social purpose?
I'll say two quick things. Quickly on affordable housing. We're currently working on 5 community-led projects, 4 of which are majority affordable housing. So just as a side on that. Just on the towers point, yes, there is. I mean, one of the reasons that people oppose housing in London right now is because people think it won't be for people like us. It'll be for Chinese mega rich. You actually see exactly the same reason in other places, which think it won't be for people like us. It'll be for incomers from elsewhere, perhaps too poor, too much social housing. So you see the same resistance to comer in as to people not like us, refracted in different ways, and more affordable than social housing in many communities, not all, does lead to increased support. But I'd come back to one of the slides, I'm afraid with numbers in, I'm sorry, which is that for most people most of the time, not all people all of the time, living in a small flat off a long corridor with sometimes inadequately controlled semi-public spaces leads to less good mental and physical health outcomes. And I, for myself, I can't speak for you, sir or madam, don't want to end up in a system whereby we're allowing prosperous people to choose, as you can see they do in the data, certain types of urban form, and we're forcing less prosperous people into physical forms that are provably less good for them. As I say, towers can work in some places for some people. They do work sometimes. They don't work most of the time, particularly historically, and still in some of the data, when it's for less.
Would anyone like to counter that position?
Well, look, I think I'm sort of repeating myself here, but the idea that we measure beauty by the length of corridors and the journey down a corridor to a flat, etc., not a great deal of light in the corridor or even in the flat, I wholly agree with. I think it should stop at the facade, though. If you did your analysis on building forms, proximity of buildings, trees, etc., that's fine. But the actual appearance of the architectural language, I think we should stop there.
But I'm saying that what you do matters. I find it odd.
I'm not saying it doesn't.
You're an architect. It matters what a building looks like. Your job is important.
I know.
You're saying it's not.
No. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. It does matter.
Why can't people be interested in it then?
But I'm not saying they shouldn't be interested in it. But I think it's a mistake to identify one as the solution as opposed to another.
But I'm not. I'm saying they all matter. I'm not saying it's only.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it comes back to your point whether it's ugly or not. So Edinburgh, Newtown, Georgian, I think all of us pretty much would say. There's very few people here who would say it's ugly, but it wasn't considered beautiful when it was first built. A lot of people really didn't like it.
I think tower blocks have had a fair crack. They've been around now for long enough for people to get used to them.
There was plenty of Georgian building. You have to remember the difference between housing, building, and architecture with a capital A, as it were. That doesn't exist anymore because it's all cleared, because it was jerry-built, back-to-back, so there's no windows at the back, rooms with no windows, etc., even in the Victorian period. All gone now. And those tower blocks built in the post-war period, a lot of those will go because they're rubbish.
Yeah.
However, the Barbican, people coming around to the idea, the Golden Lane estate coming around to the idea, these are potentially, dare I say, beautiful.
Those blocks are often they're kind of bought up there. They were bought up, by kind of people selling their council flats to people who were at the advance of the trend for mid-century architecture, weren't they?
Yeah. Well.
But
you see my point. It's not it's not necessarily an aesthetic decision. The decisions occur elsewhere. The appreciation of the aesthetic comes along later.
Alpa.
Just on that thing of if you would forgive ugly, I mean, I think maybe I'm just really naive, but I just think if something has been really well designed, it's not going to be ugly. It's going to be well received. It's going to be loved by the people that live in it. And as for is it okay if it's ugly if it has a social purpose? I mean, why would social housing be designed any different to normal non-social housing?
Because it's designed cheaper.
Well, but that's not the point. Neve Brown said about Alexandra Road, he never thought he was designing social housing. He was just designing housing, and that's the point. It should just be a good thing. That's the thing.
That's not the reality today.
Well, good design isn't necessarily more expensive, is it?
No. I totally agree with you.
Maybe that's as utopian an idea as designing for beauty. I mean, it's as kind of abstract. Really.
Look, I mean, I think the way it works, I don't think any of us would be long in the tooth in these professions if we didn't honestly believe that you are not going to sacrifice something like the beauty or good design features of a building because it had a social purpose, because in the end, most things have a social purpose. You know, an office block has a social purpose of employing people. You know, affordable housing, the whole debate about that all forms of housing need to have affordability to them. So I would very much say that, you know, the quality, the quantity and the purpose and the whole range of functions that you need to consider with any proposal is what we do. And I don't think that stark sort of choice is something that we should be making. And I don't think it's necessary in a city like London.
Okay, 2 more questions. There's one in the far back right corner, and then the one here.
Thank you very much for these inspiring talks. If you allow me, I have three small questions. So the first one, as it has been said in one of the talks, we're not building London anymore. So we will probably be tackling the problem of density in the future by going outside London, in the very close countryside. So my first question would be, how can we design or think of a more collaborative planning system that suits for this countryside and that would have the right amount of guidance and or freedom? The second question would be...
Can you just choose your favourite question of the 3? Because I'm not sure we've got time for 3. If you could pick the most urgent one.
Then the most urgent one would be, in the context of the countryside, can we redefine beauty as authenticity, or maybe add authenticity as the third pillar besides good design and beauty?
So beauty in the countryside, in a rural context, how do we define that? What are the priorities?
Would you define beauty by authenticity?
Authenticity.
And then, yeah, the question is, what's authentic? Because you could be a nasty, greedy developer and be authentic in your aim, couldn't you?
Yeah, beauty is a recipe. It's not one thing. You know, it's a whole load of different ingredients that have different, you know, it's in the context. And you can't write guidelines, strict guidelines. I mean, a lot of people will have, Nicolas, you know, when he was talking about what people saw as beautiful and scenic, I was very interested in what people see as scenic. It's like, I know from statistics as well that if you ask people what their favourite colour is, most people in Britain and in America will say blue.
Very sensible.
But it doesn't mean that blue is a better colour than red or green, you know. So it's like, it's very hard because that's a sort of knee-jerk reaction to what is beautiful. You know, I like going to the countryside, but I find it very uninspiring. It's a bit like getting into a warm bath. You know, it's nice, but I wouldn't want to live there all the time. You know? So it's the idea about what is beautiful in the countryside. I mean, sometimes I like seeing something that sticks out like a sore thumb, and I also like seeing lovely traditional architecture. And for me, because, you know, being me, the thing that really makes beauty beautiful is a kind of vitality and surprise within the kind of traditional context, and that I prioritise that. For other people, it might be that beauty is it's almost invisibly bland.
Yeah, I think we've covered some of this, but I think the idea of what is authentic is also something that in itself is quite fluid and dynamic, because it has, as we've all demonstrated, I think, in our conversations about eras of architecture that we like and whether we like tall, short, you know, fat, thin, bricks, rust, steel, wood, you know, there is something in there for everybody, and not every wood and rusty building is ugly, and certainly not every one of them is beautiful either. So I think there will always be the range of opinion. London is a fantastic city for the eclectic range of the things that go on here, and that is absolutely reflected in its architecture and the dynamism and adaptability of the places that we're in. And I think that the planning system, in enabling that, and maybe it could do it a bit better, is fit for purpose in that regard for the future.
Any other comments on authenticity before the final question of fundamental?
Is the Campanile in the Piazza San Marco in Italy, in Venice, is that beautiful? Is it authentic? It's only not authentic. It was rebuilt in 1902 when it fell down.
Right. We've had something like 70 plus years of the Town and Country Planning Act. Yeah, I think if you walk around the streets of London, 99% of the new buildings that go up are utter shit. There's a series of films in the States called The Purge, where on one night of the year, all crime is made legal. How about maybe for a couple of years we abandon planning altogether and allow people to build whatever they like? How bad can it be?
Well, I thought what you were going to say, for one night only, you could go out and purge the city of those buildings that you describe in a sort of slightly sweary way, which I can't because I work for the public sector. But
oh, go on. No one's listening.
No, I'm not doing it.
It's not being recorded.
I have children to, set an example to. No, and actually, there is a really famous case of Kensington and Chelsea demolished their listed town hall in the 1970s overnight. So, it's not actually something that hasn't been done in London. I mean, I think the indications that some of us are given in the talks around the longevity of regulation. So, yes, we've had a 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, but that's sort of where we got to in 1947. I mean, we have hundreds of years of regulation. I don't think we as a country are ready for that type of very laissez-faire approach to things. And I would agree with you, there would be some really fantastic things that could come out of that. But on the whole, I think we're not really, the character of ourselves is not such that we could really run with that degree of freedom, I'm afraid.
It's we mustn't just run. I mean, I often read about the 47 Town and Country Planning Act, but it's important not just to blame that. We made a sort of historic mistake on the motor car, and I deliberately use the sort of the mid-century term. New technology keeps coming along, and it's good and right that it does, but we need to be masters of new technology, not be its slaves. There was clearly a zeitgeist of town planning, of city engineers in the mid-century that said, here is the motor car, it is new, it is shiny, we must bifurcate our towns and places, in hock to the great god, the motor car. That was a historically wrong decision, which was made around the world. It's not just us who made it. There are exciting, important, interesting new things coming along. Clearly, autonomous cars are coming. All sorts of things are going down the way. Some we can't automate. There's the ability to link up the city and the smart city and all this. Great, but we must be masters of it. And all I'd say, in all its components, be it beauty, be it walkability, be it greenery interlace, be it variety in a pattern, be it the complexity of urban form, be it safe block structures, we must be masters of the new technology, not its slaves, as we were 70 years ago.
Who's going to argue for a free-for-all?
I think within reason. I mean, I like the idea.
Grayson, come on.
Yeah, I like the idea, particularly like owners of their own homes, that as long as they obey the safety regulations and maybe a height restriction or something.
No, I don't agree.
Just let them go.
But within components, set some strict rules and then let it rip.
Within parameters.
Yeah, I mean, you can't do something that would endanger or inconvenience other people, but how it actually looks aesthetically and the shape of the rooms or whatever you want to do, and what materials you use, just go for it.
Yeah.
Because I would love to walk down the street where every third house was a bit bonkers.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But I mean, I don't think that. I don't know. I can't speak for you, but would that count as a purge?
I don't think they would be bonkers either, though. I think they would. You just get a lot of Renaissance courts
Yeah.
because it would be people just trying to make what they know, which might be the thing next to them. What I was going to say is, I don't think the planning system or regulation is the enemy. One thing I've learned from working in a local authority now is there are a lot of crap architects. There are a lot of really rubbish schemes that come forward. And actually, it's quite good being a planner because I can stand at the sluice gate and prevent a lot of this crap that might get built. So actually, be careful what you wish for, I say.
Last word, Amin?
No.
Okay, good. Perfect note to end on. Can I just ask you all to thank our wonderful speakers and thank you all for coming.